welcome to the channel. I'm speaking with Professor Alex de Waal, who is the Executive Director of the World Peace Channel. I'm speaking with Professor Alex de Waal, who is the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts University. His scholarly work includes researching humanitarian crises and response, human rights, HIV/AIDS, and governance in Africa. And his conflict and peace building work has led him to investigate the Tigray region in Ethiopia and Sudan. Following a fellowship with the Global Equity Initiative at Harvard from 2004 to 2006, he worked with the Social Science Research Council as director of the program on HIV and AIDS and social transformation, and led projects on conflict and humanitarian crises in Africa. Alex was second to the African Union's mediation team for Darfur, and he served from 2009 to 2011 as senior advisor to the African Union High-Level Implementation Panel for Sudan, where he took on a number of roles in the negotiations leading to the independence of South Sudan. His publications include The Real Politics of the Horn of Africa and Mass Starvation, The History and the Future of Famine. I'm pleased to have Professor de Waal on the program. Welcome.
You are very welcome. Nice to be with you.
I would like to start the discussion with two announcements coming from the United Nations. Firstly, the renewal of the mandate of the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights Violations in Eritrea. And secondly, the Human Rights Council adopting a new resolution to investigate human rights violations committed in Tigray since the conflict began in November 2020. How important are these steps taken, and are we starting to see soft pressures like diplomatic activity work?
It's really too early to tell whether these are going to work, whether these types of activities, initiatives are going to see substantive change. I think the significance of them is that they show that the multilateral order, the commitment to principles of human rights and international law, and international cooperation according to some basic norms and principles is still alive, that there is still a commitment that no country should be exempt from the standards that are applied across the board on the question of human rights, that sovereignty cannot be a shield behind which abusive or dictatorial regimes can shelter, cannot be a pretext for exercising impunity.
The African Union, meanwhile, has been generally ineffective and unresponsive in its effort to call for mediation in the Tigray conflict, and at one point even supported the Ethiopian government's position after the attacks occurred in Maikadra. And similarly, we have seen many African countries also side with or abstain from the war and its effects on the region. Is this principle of non-interference hubris and hypocrisy?
I think it is hubris, it is hypocrisy. The predecessor of the African Union, the Organization for African Unity, was clearly identified as having failed on many accounts in the early 1990s. On the one hand, its historic mission, which was to free Africa from European colonization and racist rule, was achieved with the ending of apartheid in the election of the first democratic non-racial government in South Africa. On the other hand, the failure of the OAU to deal with domestic abuses, coups d'etat, lack of democracy was frankly scandalous. And that culminated with it standing by during the genocide of 1994 in Rwanda. And in the 10 years after that, the African leaders got together. They recognized that the continent would rise together or would fall together. And they adopted a set of principles, starting with the notion of sovereignty as responsibility, the notion of non-indifference, that it was necessary and there was an obligation to prevent gross abuses in countries like Rwanda, the principle of respecting constitutionalism, of promoting democracy, the principle of being obliged to offer and accept good faith offers of mediation to end conflict. And these, in the early 2000s, were remarkably successful in entrenching some fundamental principles and helping Africa move forward. I think what is particularly unfortunate and tragic at the moment is that the African Union is turning its back on the very principle that it itself pioneered some 10, 15, 20 years ago, that it is actually repudiating the progress that it as Africa pioneered. And so it is, I think, profoundly hypocritical for the African nations and the African Union to go back to the principles of the 1980s regarding sovereignty as a shield behind which gross violations can be committed, and to condemn the Western nations for challenging that, when it was Africa itself that took the lead in articulating those principles.
Of course, Ethiopia is the site of the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. How much of a role has that played in the influence of the response from African states?
I think the fact that Ethiopia is the host of the AU is really quite important. It has always treated Ethiopia as a bit of a special case. It has always indulged Ethiopia in a way that other countries have not been indulged. But the African Union does have a history of being able to stand up to some of the major powers in the continent, including Egypt, including Nigeria at different times. So there's really no reason why the procedures of the African Union, particularly the Peace and Security Council, should not be applied in a case like the civil war and the mass atrocities in Ethiopia. It really does reflect very badly on the leadership of the African continent.
I'd like to turn to the elections that recently occurred in Ethiopia. The federal election results, for the most part, have been called, with Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed declaring victory as the Prosperity Party established a huge majority, winning 97% of the seats in the House of Federation. Of course, many other constituencies, including parts of Oromia, Harare, and Somali, have not been able to participate on the day of voting, and some areas like Tigray are probably not going to be able to exercise their right to vote. In addition, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to affect Ethiopia, with some of the highest rates of infection seen in the region starting to affect the population since the pandemic began in March 2020. Was the postponement of the elections in 2020 a way to allow Abiy and his relevant political actors to coordinate and plan an attack on Tigray?
I think the postponement of the election arose through a multitude of factors, and I don't think that there was a single conspiracy or a single determinant of the postponement. There was a legitimate reason for postponing due to COVID. Also, the disarray in the country a year ago was good enough reason for postponement. The Tigrayans showed in September that it was possible to hold an orderly election. Of course, the federal government repudiated that, and then the Tigrayans in turn repudiated the legitimacy of the federal government, which was a needless escalation. I think the key elements behind the recent election are that the great majority of opposition parties and leaders were not able to participate. They were banned. Many of them were imprisoned. The media was not free. There's been an extraordinarily wide-ranging crackdown on the media and far stricter censorship than was in place before Abiy came to power and had his much heralded liberalization. And the media, therefore, has been filled with the propaganda of the government and was filled with pro-government messages, including a lot of extremely vitriolic anti-Tigrayan messages and very pro-Amhara messages. And in that context, and in the context of Abiy Ahmed being able to conceal from the public for a critical time the extent of his military disaster in Tigray, it was possible for him to command the political space much in the same way as the EPRDF did in 2010 and 2015 and win, close to 100% of the seats in an overwhelming majority. And I think his election has pretty much the same level of democratic credentials as the ones that went before it.
Has this election process given Prime Minister Abiy and his supporters the notion that he has a legal constitutional mandate to continue enacting his policies?
I think one of the very interesting things about Ethiopia at the moment is that Abiy is certainly extremely popular among his constituency in Addis Ababa and in parts of Amhara and one or two other places in the country. And he certainly feels that he has that mandate. The reality is, however, that his government is crumbling around him. I mean, he has suffered a calamitous military defeat for which he was really has to bear overwhelming responsibility. He's facing an extraordinarily rapid economic meltdown with inflation galloping away and deteriorating material conditions, food crisis in much of the country. And if the military advance of the Tigrayan Defense Force continues, that crisis is only going to escalate. So regardless of whether he considers his mandate legitimate, regardless of his popularity, he's facing a crisis not only for his government, but potentially an existential crisis for the Ethiopian state. And there's an irony here, because he was the one who invited the Eritreans, he invited President Isaias to actually be the senior partner in the security and political strategy, not just for Tigray, but for the region as a whole, the wider Horn of Africa region, including relations with Somalia and so on. And we have known for many years that the ambition of Isaias was to crush Tigray and to weaken and really dismantle the cohesion of Ethiopia. And in the short term, they did crush Tigray, but Tigray rebounded, and the anger of the people was such that they could resist. But the other element in Isaias's project, which is disassembling Ethiopia, seems to be being realized at the expense of Ethiopia as a working country.
It's interesting you mentioned President Isaias in this context. Going briefly to the conversation of non-indifference or non-interference, Ethiopia has rebuked many of the attempts to negotiate with other African countries that tried to work in the past, including Sirleaf in Liberia and Museveni in Uganda. But he has accepted almost unconditionally the support of President Isaias in his effort to crush the Tigrayans. Why do you think that was the case? Is it really to consolidate power or to appease Abiy's short-term security interest?
I think both, to consolidate power, to appease short-term security interests, also because from the very beginning, Abiy, like Isaias, has really shown no regard for the norms and principles and institutions of the African Union. When Abiy reached out on the instructions of the then EPRDF to make peace with Isaias, the peace agreement, the Algiers peace agreement of 2000, was actually drafted and owned by the African Union. And the African Union has a set of practices and principles whereby the implementation of a peace agreement should be transparent. It should have within it third-party monitoring, in this case, African monitoring, demilitarization, normalization of relations, not just between the heads of state, but among the population, democratization. Instead of that, Isaias and Abiy went first to Abu Dhabi and then to Jeddah. And they shunned the African Union. They shunned all those principles of democratization, of multilateralism, preferring instead to cut a secret deal. And the secret deal is no longer secret. It was a war pact against Tigray, which was calamitous, not just for the people of Tigray, but also for the people of Eritrea and the people of Ethiopia. And I think that repudiation of those fundamental norms and principles lies very much at the heart of Ethiopia's reckless descent into its current crisis. Because although the OAU and the AU have always treated Ethiopia with kid gloves, nonetheless, as the other part of the bargain has been that Ethiopia has been respectful of the African Union. So the previous Ethiopian governments were very active in promoting regional peace and security and sending peacekeepers, in promoting norms and so on. I mean, Ethiopia was among the very first nations back in 1948 to sign the Genocide Convention. And now the Genocide Convention is likely to be waved in the face of Abiy. And he, of course, will then try and reject it. And in rejecting it, he will be actually repudiating one of the noblest aspects of Ethiopia's history, which is this commitment to principled multilateralism going all the way back to Haile Selassie.
Of course, you referenced Isaias and Abiy's recent trip, or rather long trip to Abu Dhabi and Jeddah back after the peace deal was signed during the era of the peace deal. He wrote Prime Minister Abiy in Project Syndicate on February 6th, an open article which either rebuked or scuffed or did something to essentially negate the African principles of diplomacy that you were mentioning. How important is it that Abiy has outwardly rejected any sort of mediation in this respect? It seems like as long as his goals are accomplished, there's really nothing that is stopping him from achieving his mission, which has been to carry out a military campaign in Tigray. And he stated previously that it was a law enforcement operation. How do you perceive this?
Well, it's also notable that February the 6th, when this op-ed was published, was the first day of the African Union Summit. And not only did Abiy in this article you mentioned make no mention of the African Union and its norms and principles, but the African Union took the insult. It did not rebuke Abiy for having essentially insulted them. And as you say, I think for him, power is its own justification. And he is a very different character to Isaias. I mean, Isaias is a ruthless, scheming, unprincipled Machiavellian who is also a master of calculation. And he knows when to push, when to withdraw, when to confront, when to back down. Abiy does not have those skills. Abiy does not have the skills of managing a state or indeed statecraft. He is capable of escalating violence, which he is doing with this mass mobilization of peasant armies and this very polarizing rhetoric. But he has no indication that he is ready actually to recognize the limits of his power and the need for those political skills of backing down, climbing down a ladder and negotiating. And on that course, where the only possible outcomes are either that he realizes this grandiose dream of a mythical Ethiopia reinvented in his image with him at the head, which is completely unrealizable, or he will fall. And insofar as he tries to hang on to power, it will not be just him that falls, but the whole of Ethiopia will fall too. And I think that is what the prospect that we have in the coming weeks and months.
This destabilizing circumstance has really torn Ethiopia apart in the past year. And I think it's, just from my personal perspective, it's served Abiy well, especially in the run-up to the Ethiopian elections. Do you think scheduling the elections in the midst of chaos, and not just in Tigray, but also with the increasing level of tension between Egypt and Sudan over the GERD, was a way for Abiy to distract the population enough to give himself reason to become a leader who could be perceived as trusted?
I don't think he is trusted. I think there are he is profoundly distrusted by most people because he has now a terrible reputation for not telling the truth. But he does have his devoted band of followers. And among them, we can see, his own church people, many Pentecostalists who have an unlimited faith that there will be some divine intervention to deliver a great Ethiopia. You have those historic sort of Abyssinian fundamentalists who want to resurrect this old dream of the imperial empire. And of course, you have people who have business interests and other interests. And I think the business community must be deeply alarmed at the moment, because what they can see before their eyes is the prospect of the economic growth that they had hoped for is now vanishing. I mean, Ethiopia was an economic success story until the last 2 years, and now it is becoming a basket case. And its reputation among the international financial institutions, the private sector, is now calamitous. People will not invest in Ethiopia, and those Ethiopians who have in themselves invested are going to be facing terrible losses. So whatever tactical steps that Abiy might have taken to preserve and enhance his power, surely this is now unraveling in the face of military, economic, and ultimately political reality.
Going to the peace deal that you mentioned briefly, the contents of the deal have not explicitly been revealed, although you do allude the war pact narrative, and I do think that is a legitimate claim at this point, considering what's happened in Tigray. Abiy Ahmed and Isaias Afwerki seem to have organized a loose confederation based off of their shared security and political interest in subduing their opposition. Will their alliance exist as long as their mutual interest does?
I think it's very questionable whether Abiy will continue as a powerful player. And I think that Isaias, who is much smarter than Abiy and has a much better grasp of political, military, and strategic realities, is clearly from the statements that we hear, is becoming deeply frustrated with the recklessness and the lack of political skills of Abiy. So I think that Isaias will seek for a new partner. I think also that Ethiopians will surely be aware that Isaias is not a reliable partner. Isaias will do what is best for him under any and all circumstances. And who knows what his next step will be.
Some foreign journalists and researchers have made the request for the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to resign in protest over the current situation in Tigray, while other scholars have called for the outright revocation of the 2019 prize awarded to Prime Minister Abiy. My question is, should the lack of jointly awarding Isaias the Nobel Peace Prize been a clear signal that genuine reform had not taken place?
I think you're absolutely right. I think normally in those circumstances, when Nelson Mandela got it, then F.W. de Klerk got it. Usually when two countries or two parties make peace, the prize is shared. And I think the fact that they couldn't stomach giving it to Isaias should have been a warning sign that all was not well.
Why did the history of the Eritrean regime not cross the committee's mind? And they decided to applaud Abiy on his efforts to negotiate with one of the most deceptive and appalling dictatorships in the world. He said himself in his speech that he accepted the award on behalf of the Eritrean government.
That question needs to be posed to the Nobel Committee. I mean, I think it's not just the Nobel Committee that's being tarnished by this, but every recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize must now feel somehow touched by the stain of that, let me say, misguided award.
Going to probably one of the most pressing issues in the conflict today, and something that you've talked about at length, is the crisis of famine, especially within the last month or so. You recently called the starvation crimes in Tigray abhorrent and a clear indication that what is happening is a signal of a man-made famine. How did this develop in such a short amount of time?
Back in the 1980s, Ethiopia was the land of famine. Tigray and Wollo were the epicenter of that. And then the EPRDF, when it came to power in 1991, it did many things wrong. But one thing that everybody recognized that it did right was its policies for famine prevention, not just in Tigray, but across the whole of Ethiopia. The development policies, the poverty reduction, the food security programs, the productive safety net program, etc. So Ethiopia was actually was freed of that stigma of being the land of famine. So what does it take to bring famine back to a land where it has been abolished? And it takes political and military action. And this was a deliberate campaign by Abiy, by Isaias, by the Amhara militia, to pillage Tigray, to strip it of everything that could be taken away or destroyed, to destroy everything that was indispensable for human survival, to reduce the Tigrayans to destitution and penury. And the result is, as was eminently foreseeable and has been predicted for some months, a terrible famine, the likes of which we've not seen for decades. And as we speak, probably as many as 1 million people are now in famine conditions in Tigray. The fact that the Ethiopian federal forces have been driven out and the Eritrean troops have withdrawn means that those particular starvation crimes, the looting, the pillaging, the destruction, the rape, are not being committed. But Tigray is under siege. As of the middle of June, the international agencies estimated that you really needed about 100 trucks of food aid every day for July, August, and September to stop a famine. In the last 3 and a bit weeks, just one convoy of 50 trucks has managed to get in, a drop in the bucket. So Tigray is being besieged and the people are starving. And there is, I'm afraid, no doubt that over the coming months, 10,000, 20, 30,000 young children will die of starvation, because it is those young children who die first.
Of course, international agencies are responding to the crisis, probably not as quickly as we might have hoped. What stock do you place in the reports from the World Food Program, Doctors Without Borders, and UN agencies who are trying to save the population into starvation? Do you take the quantitative statistics that they report into account when addressing the severity of the crimes?
What they have been able to report, what they've been able to find, is not the full picture. Their access has been really quite limited. And privately, what they say is that they're confident that the situation is always worse than they say in public. And everything we know about how food systems work, about how famine is caused, tells us that that situation is truly desperate.
Comparing the 1984-85 famine to what is happening today, I know you've spoken on this issue numerous times. What is the particular or unique circumstance about this crisis that is occurring today, which is different from what happened in 1984? We knew that drought and also war contributed to the previous conditions which led to famine, but it seems like as more reporting of the conflict has emerged, that the impact of the conflict has really taken a toll on the Tigrayan farmers and their land, which has been deemed useless.
Yeah. Well, I've been studying famine and war, particularly in Northeast Africa now since 1984. And worked in Somalia, in Sudan, in South Sudan, in Rwanda, etc. And I've never seen a situation that is as bad as this. I've never seen such a range of brutal starvation crime, a range of such deliberate creation of famine. There is really no natural calamity factor here at all. The locusts, they came and went. They had an impact, but it was managed. This is entirely a man-made famine. And we can name the men who made it. The Prime Minister of Ethiopia, President of Eritrea.
Maybe going into a more broad conversation about atrocities that have been committed, it seems that the ongoing crisis of repression has been extended now with tens of thousands of Tigrayan civilians reaching the Kuba refugee camp in Hamdayet in Sudan for safety since November. Peacekeeping troops of Tigrayan origin have also sought asylum. Government officials, employees of large corporations, and ordinary Tigrayan residents living in Addis Ababa and other places have been at risk of ethnic profiling and violence. From your conversations that you've had with Tigrayans since the conflict began, and even before the buildup to war, how has the Ethiopian social fabric been affected by the atrocities committed?
It is desperately sad to see how the fabric really has been torn apart, how the high level encouragement of hatred and hostility has gone down into the ordinary people, and how the victims and survivors from Tigray have felt that they are not only personally victims, but also they as people are not wanted in Ethiopia. And it will take generations for Ethiopia to recover from this. One of the things that we learn from studying mass violence during war, especially rape, is that it doesn't just happen. It's not just soldiers out of control, undisciplined soldiers. It actually has to be ordered. There has to be an instruction from on high. This is what you have to do. I mean, men, do commit rape, but the rape on this widespread and systematic scale does not happen through men misbehaving. It happens because they are told to do it. And the culpability of this goes right to the top. And it is not only a crime against those women who suffer, but it is in the broader sense a crime against humanity, because it destroys the basic principles on which a society can hold together.
Speaking on the issue of rape in particular, and speaking as an Eritrean, sometimes the issue of the military service in Eritrea has been maybe overlooked or not considered when understanding the particular instance of Eritreans committing atrocities in Tigray, not to excuse their behavior, but to explain what they're doing. Do you think that this should be taken into account? Because the brutalization of society has slowly degenerated and denigrated the legacy of Eritrea into a modern day Sparta state, where conscripts are essentially brainwashed into thinking that the people on the other side of the border are their enemies.
I think that is one of the greatest tragedies. I mean, I was in Eritrea at the time of liberation, and I was there with all that sense of optimism, of the sense that the sacrifice is made, willingly by the Eritrean people to achieve their freedom, were going to result in a new society with true values where human rights was enshrined, not just at the top, but also within the population. And what we've seen is a total abandonment, a total desecration of the memory and the principles for which so many Eritreans struggled for so long. And as you say, the systematic brutalization, traumatization, inculcation of strange values into a whole generation of young people, so that their minds are closed and their hearts are twisted. And then, yes, it is not surprising to see them being ready to follow these depraved orders to loot, to kill, and to rape when they went into Tigray. And it's desperately sad.
Another instance of atrocities, which I think is going to grow increasingly relevant as investigations start to occur in Tigray, are the destruction of historically significant cultural sites, most notably in Aksum, which is arguably one of the heartlands of Ethiopian history. A massacre of Tigrayans occurred in the time around Prime Minister Abiy announced that the military victory had been achieved. The categorical denials and tacit admissions with half-truths into outright justifications of this brutality, of this act of violence, has been permeating the Ethiopian body politic. To what extent do you think that the destruction of cultural sites will have an effect on Ethiopian society?
I think all these sort of ethical violations will reverberate. It is Abiy, he inherited a state. He inherited an authoritarian state. He inherited an Ethiopian population that had many problems and many divisions. But in his reckless pursuit of his own sense of mission, he's actually leaving Ethiopia with a dismantled state, perhaps with a failed state, and with a society with its moral and cultural fabric really deeply torn and depraved. Many authoritarian rulers, kill people, but then historians afterwards say, well, he built a state. In the case of Abiy, he kills people, but he's actually destroying the state that he inherited.
It's really concerning to see that the increasing dissolution of Ethiopia has started to manifest itself into the region, and there are increasing calls for Tigray to become an independent country. There are other instances where many ethnic opposition groups to Abiy have started to call for self-autonomy and go further and instead call for the breakup of the country. And some people have related this instance to the example of the former Yugoslavia. It's disheartening to see that happen. Even though I'm not Ethiopian, it's sometimes worrying to see that start to become the mainstream topic of discussion when relaying these instances of atrocities committed during the war in Tigray, and even before that with other aggrieved parties. Do you think that it is viable that this could happen if the situation does not get better?
It is perfectly viable. And Ethiopians, when they read their history, tend to focus on the stories of great kings who were centralizing rulers, who built the empire. And they tend to overlook periods in which Ethiopia fell apart, the era of the princes, for example, when there were many competing warlords. But those other periods of chaos and turmoil and fragmentation are equally a reality in the history of Ethiopia. And there is nothing special about the Ethiopian people that means that cannot happen again. And I think Ethiopians are looking at that reality in the face right now.
Of course, leaders in the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front have been harping on the possibility of them becoming an independent country. But personally, it seems like if it were to happen, then they would go against the founding principles of the Ethiopian Constitution, which is the institution of ethnic federalism as a means to give people the right to self-autonomy. Should Tigray break up, is that a hypocritical stance that they take, or a justified necessary action to protect their people?
Well, Article 39 of the Constitution does allow for a regional state within the federation to opt for self-determination, including separation. And there's a complicated procedure for doing that. So the idea behind the federation was that actually it was the willing coming together of the different peoples of Ethiopia that would make it a viable country. And so it is actually in the spirit of that, yeah, they can depart, which is not to say that it's a good idea, because I think even those who maybe are ardent supporters of independence would have to admit that it is a very, very rough road, because not only would Tigray face enormous obstacles as an independent state, but the secession of Tigray would very likely have major knock-on consequences for the rest of Ethiopia, and it would not be good for Tigray to be next door to a destabilized big brother.
I'd like to turn the conversation to more of a general understanding of the Horn of Africa in the midst of this conflict. In particular, the involvement of Eritrean troops, which we'll start to focus on in particular in the conflict at the behest of the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki, and his regime. The New York Times recently interviewed the Tigrayan regional president, Debretsion Gebremichael, and many political and military revelations came to light in that interview he gave since the capture of the regional capital of Mekelle by the TDF militias. And one resounding comment that Debretsion made was on the fate of the Eritrean government after the conflict. And he said that the TDF have to be, quote, realistic. Yes, we would like to remove Isaias, but at the end of the day, Eritreans have to remove him. Firstly, do you agree with his statement?
I think that's absolutely correct. I think it would be wrong and hazardous for an outside power to go in and change the government.
Is the answer that he gave a sign of diplomatic maturity on the part of Tigray? And is it a skill or a concession to the Eritrean people to overthrow the Eritrean dictatorship? In other words, I would say that is Debretsian's answer that he gave to the reporter a sign that the TPLF and the Tigrayan authorities are thinking ahead of the consequences should that occur?
Immediate context of the statement was the pressing question, which is, would the Tigray Defense Forces, having defeated the Ethiopians, now go after the Eritreans? And had the Eritrean Defense Force stayed in Tigray in large numbers, they would certainly have gone after them. And they clearly see the Eritrean army as the major military threat that they face. They're obviously under a lot of international pressure not to cross the border. And so I think tactically speaking, they are well advised to not do that. I think in the longer term, they'll be keeping their options open, because they would not want to face the kind of threat that they go through the kind of experience they've been going through in the last 8 months ever again.
Do you think that the leaders of the current Tigrayan parties involved in the conflict need to differentiate the atrocities committed by the Eritrean dictatorship with those of the Eritrean people in order to prevent worsening relations between the two entities? I've seen in the discourse between Eritreans and Tigrayans that there is a very serious mistrust of one another, and I think it'd be helpful for the leadership from Tigray to outwardly express that they fully understand what's happening in Eritrea.
I think they do understand it, and I can't speak for them. I think it would be appropriate for them to do something that the EPRDF really failed to do over the last 20 years, which is to properly provide space for an Eritrean democratic opposition. I mean, one of the things that the EPRDF government consistently did was it tried to interfere with and control the Eritrean opposition instead of giving them space and freedom to sort things out for themselves. And they actually, I think, undermined the prospects of democratization in Eritrea.
What is your message to those who may see you as partial to the conflict?
Well, first of all, let me say that throughout my career, in every activist engagement with Africa until this year, I've always worked for an African institution with an African boss. So I worked with, back in the day, in the late 80s, early 90s, with African rights under a Somali director. And I took the principal decision to resign from Human Rights Watch on the objecting to the United States military intervention in Somalia. I wanted Somalis to find a solution. And that was a decision that cost me my job and got me recognition as one of those non-Africans who stood up for African principles. I later went on to work for two other human rights organizations, African Rights, led by Africans, Justice Africa, led by Africans. And the first action that Justice Africa did, it was founded at the time of the Ethio-Eritrean War, 1999. Our first activity was to expose the abuses associated with the expulsions of the Eritreans from Ethiopia. I worked very closely with Eritrean civil society organizations and indeed the PFDJ to put a case to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and to expose what had been going on. I criticized the Ethiopian government of Meles Zenawi, who was also a friend, but I was also his critic on a number of occasions as well. So, I find it amusing that, as somebody who worked with Africans, with my close colleague, the late Tajuddin Abdurrahim, the Secretary General of the Pan-African Movement, we worked together for all those years. And those who then say, oh, I'm some sort of neo-colonialist, obviously are not familiar with my personal history and my writing, and they are just selectively misrepresenting what I've written over the years and who I am. And the reason why they try and do this is because they don't like the fact that I'm saying some unpleasant truths about what is going on in their countries. It's as simple as that.
Professor de Waal, I'd like to give you the final word.
I mean, for me, the great tragedy of what we're confronting now is that the principles, the norms, that so many of us, Africans and non-Africans, worked together to build up. When I was working for the African Union, it's the only international organization I have ever worked for, the African Union. We were really involved in a principled project of building a new continent. And it did have real popular resonance and support. And the work I've done with civil society, exactly the same. And the people who we worked with, the people whose experiences we reflected and whose principles and that we tried to espouse, they're still there. And we are now looking into an abyss, a potential catastrophic ethical and social collapse in the Horn of Africa. And we need to turn away from that before it is too late. And those resources for doing so are there in Africa, should the people who are in positions of power and influence choose to draw upon them.
Professor de Waal, I'd like to thank you for appearing on the platform.
You're very welcome.